It's no secret that it's tough to get bread right. Screw up just one thing and you'll end up with a loaf that didn't rise, one that got super dense, or one that's still goopy in the middle. Here are the most common pitfalls standing between you and a perfect loaf. Back when your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents used to bake bread, chances are they only had one option when it came to flour. That's definitely not the case today. While you still might choose all-purpose flour for some breads, there's also whole wheat flour, almond flour, white whole wheat flour, and so on and so on. And each of those flours acts a little differently. According to the experts, treating them all the same and trying to use them interchangeably will absolutely ruin your bread. Say you use Grandma's recipe for bread, which may have been written with all-purpose flour in mind. You want a loaf of wheat bread, though, and it's not going to work as written. Whole wheat flour is much more absorbent than the recipe's assuming your flour is, and you'll end up using more water and getting a super sticky dough that's incredibly hard to knead right. That's even further complicated by the fact that coarse whole wheat flour will break up gluten and protein chains if it's overworked, and you'll end up with a loaf that crumbles instead of cuts. Every type of flour has different properties, so match your flour to your recipe, and it'll be easier to get your proportions 100% correct. We're all looking for ways to get healthier, and it might seem like swapping low-fat oils or butters into your bread is an easy way to cut back. But it's not, and here's why. Fats play a key role in the chemistry of baking. They're necessary for lubricating the dough and retaining gases, which not only helps the loaf rise, but also keeps it fresh. When you're using a standard, full-fat version of whatever butter or oil you're mixing into your dough, you're probably fine. The problems start when you try to use reduced fat ingredients, partially because the lower fat content means you'd have to use more than the recipe calls for to get the same effect, and that's going to mess up your water and liquid ratios. Also, reduced fat spreads and butters are made with a different process than the regular kind. Since they have more water, a different chemical emulsion is needed to keep the water and fats mixed. So when you go to mix it into your dough, it's not going to incorporate as well as a full-fat product would. You should always make sure you're using an ingredient that contains 70% or more fat. Otherwise, your bread is going to be tough, chewy, and dry. Whether it's white sugar, brown sugar, molasses, or fruit juice, sugars essentially act as the fuel for yeast. Yeast needs it to work and undergo the process that's going to make your bread rise. If there's not enough sugar, the yeast isn't going to work well because it doesn't have enough of that fuel to feed on. But if you add too much sugar, you'll end up getting the same lackluster effect, this time because the extra sugar is stealing water away from the yeast. That's why sweetbreads always call for more yeast than savory ones. And here's another thing. If you add your yeast and then sugars right on top of it, it'll slow the process down and your bread's not going to rise. To get this particular process to work right, you'll have to mix it precisely according to your recipe. Yeast also doesn't feed on artificial sweeteners, so you can't use them to replace sugar and get the same loaf of bread. And the darker the sugar, the more quickly the bread is going to brown. So keep that in mind when you're setting your time and temperature. Hydration is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of liquid in your dough. One of the most common reasons a loaf doesn't rise is because it doesn't have the right liquid-to-flour ratio. A well-proportioned dough shouldn't stick to your hands or to the side of the mixing bowl in a way that makes it frustrating to peel off. It should only feel tacky to the touch, and when it does, that means the dough is the right environment for the gluten to stretch and the yeast to feed, releasing carbon dioxide to cause the bread to rise. It's not just water you have to worry about. You also have to consider milk, fruit juices, and sneakier sources of moisture like eggs, fats, or liquid sweeteners. Keep that in mind if you're tempted to add something the recipe doesn't call for. It's all going to change what's happening in your dough. Just because the water coming out of your tap is safe to drink doesn't mean it's going to make for great bread. If there's chlorine in your water, it can interfere with the way enzymes in the dough work, and that'll change the final product. Yeast is also super sensitive to chlorine, so if you've got chlorinated water running through your pipes, you might want to filter it for the sake of making bread. If you have hard water, which is to say water with high levels of calcium and magnesium ions, that's also going to interfere with the chemical process of your baking. The gluten won't be as pliable and the fermentation rate will slow, but having water that's too soft is just as bad.
They gotta be soft. How soft? Not too soft.
Without those minerals, your dough won't form into that firm ball you're looking for. If your tap water isn't right down the middle on the hardness scale, you might want to find an alternative.
Not too hard, not too soft.
Here's a mistake that's super easy to make, especially considering most of us aren't used to cooking with ingredients that are actually living things like yeast. While most ingredients are fine if they sit in your cupboard for a while, if that dry yeast has been there for a bit, it might be dead. It also might be dead if it was stored improperly or past its best if used by date. This is one of those times those dates actually mean something's really honestly gone off, because yeast will become less and less active with age. That's even true if you haven't opened it yet. Properly storing your yeast is crucial too, and if it's kept in a way that brings it into contact with air, heat, or moisture, it's going to degrade very quickly. So keep it in a cool, dry place in your fridge or in your freezer. Whether you're kneading by hand or with a stand mixer, it's a crucial part of the process that's incredibly easy to get wrong. Kneading bread develops not just gluten, but in turn also develops a sort of straight network of proteins that allows bread to rise while still holding together. But here's the thing, if you don't knead bread long enough, you won't get enough air in the dough. But if you knead it too much, you're also going to damage your dough. The movement of the dough, your hands, and the dough hook is going to cause too much heat to build up and too much air to get into the mix, which will make a loaf that doesn't have too much flavor. The key is to look for a few things in your dough. It should easily pull free of the sides of the bowl or your work surface. And when you pull it, it should remind you a bit of a rubber band in the way it snaps back. If that's your dough, stop kneading. Not everyone has a stand mixer, and you certainly don't need one to knead bread. But according to America's Test Kitchen, having one saves you from making a few mistakes. For starters, it means you're working the dough in a more uniform fashion. It takes a lot of muscle to knead dough in a regular way for 20 to 25 minutes after all. But there's something else at work here too. You're also keeping your liquid to flour ratios more exact. What's the first thing you do when you're kneading by hand? You sprinkle some flour on the work surface, on your hands, and on the dough to keep it from sticking. You probably do that a few more times over the course of the kneading process, and if you use too much flour, that can turn into a huge mistake. While some doughs might need a little extra flour, they're not going to need a lot, not if you're following the recipe right at least. If you do add too much, it's going to change the texture of your loaf into something you're not going to want to replicate ever. Baking bread is tricky, and you can even make mistakes as you're doing nothing but watching the clock. First off, never forget to cover your bread with a protective little hat. And that's not even a joke. A shower cap can work pretty brilliantly for this step. You can also use plastic wrap or a clean tea towel. You're basically covering it to keep the moisture in. That'll also keep the skin of the dough from drying out too much, but there's nothing wrong with it drying slightly. Breaking that skin when you're splitting your dough and putting it into bread pans is a mistake too, because if you don't break that super thin skin, you'll be able to cut long, deliberate slashes in the top to give the bread a place to break and fold as it bakes and expands, which will give you a much better looking loaf. How many times have you pulled a loaf of bread out of the oven and been disappointed that it didn't rise much? Your mistake might not have had anything to do with the recipe or ingredients at all. It may have risen just fine, but if you used the wrong size pan, it certainly won't look that way. And we're not even talking about a huge difference in pan sizes. You might have 2 different size bread pans in your cupboards right now and not even realize it. There's 9 by 5 inch pans and there's 8.5 by 4.5 inch pans. Is that really enough to make a difference? Yes, it is. The bigger pans are actually for breads that don't use yeast, like your favorite banana bread. The smaller pans are for breads that call for yeast, and that 1/2 inch makes a huge difference. Do the math and you'll find that the bigger pan actually has about 30% more room in it, and that means yeast breads aren't going to rise as big and tall in the bigger pan. Size does matter. You've measured and mixed, kneaded and proofed, and finally, you've baked. You're in the clear now, right? Not exactly. If you've ever pulled the pan out of the oven and left it somewhere to cool, you're not doing it any favors. The most you should do is let yeast bread rest in the pan for about 5 minutes, then transfer it to a wire rack. That 5 minutes isn't always necessary either, and it's only to allow a slightly wobbly loaf to firm up a bit. Ideally, you'll want to transfer it to a rack immediately after taking it out of the oven. That'll prevent the crust from getting tough, and no one wants a super tough crust. Here's another tip for getting the crust just right. If your bread seems to be as brown as you want it, but it still has some baking time left, don't take it out of the oven early. Just cover it gently with a piece of aluminum foil and let it finish the bake time. That way, you should be able to take it out of the pan immediately. Look at it this way. It'll cool faster, and it'll be ready to eat faster too.
There's a lot that can go awry with brownies. They can be too cakey, they can have rock-hard edges with an undercooked middle, and they can be lacking flavour. But better brownies are easily attainable, especially if you know what it is you're doing wrong. As with most baked goods, the amount of time brownies spend in the oven can make or break them. And if you're looking for that spectacularly fudgy texture from edge to edge, it can be difficult to know just how long those brownies need to bake. So, what's the trick? Well, the tried and true method of using a toothpick or a cake tester won't work. That's because properly fudgy brownies are always going to yield a chocolate-coated toothpick when you poke them. And if they don't, you've entered into the dreaded overbaked and cakey territory. Aside from following a trusted recipe to a T, which is even more important with brownies than other treats, it's a good idea to rotate the pan halfway through the cooking time. Since most ovens have hot and cool spots, this ensures that the brownies will bake evenly. Those are the basics, and following those rules will probably afford you fine brownies. But the real way to tell when your brownies have reached optimal doneness? Check for the crack. Catsy Guy Hamilton, Global Director of Food and Beverage for chocolatier Max Brenner, said that once the top is shiny and set, the first cracks are a telltale sign that your brownies are ready. In this case, no matter what the timer says, yank those bad boys from the oven. The result should be fudgy and gooey, but not underbaked. Perfection.
Oh! We should be having brownies!
Maybe you made an entire batch of brownies for yourself and don't care how easily or not easily they come out because you're going to eat them straight out of the pan with a fork. We salute you. But for those of you who want to share a brownie or two and also want them to look like they didn't get put through the wood chipper first, you really should think about lining the pan with parchment paper. It's an extra step, yes, but it ensures that each and every brownie will come out of the pan perfectly, even the dreaded first brownie, with no chance of sticking. Real Simple recommends creating a sling with 2 strips of parchment by buttering or spraying the pan and laying 1 strip into the pan, leaving an overhang on 2 sides. Butter or spray that strip, then press the second strip in to overhang the 2 remaining sides. 1 more coat of butter or spray and in goes the batter. Once cool, all you need to do is grab the overhanging parchment to use as handles and voila! No fuss, no muss. Easily cuttable brownies. You might think that ooey gooey melted chocolate would be the superior choice when it comes to brownie baking, but you would be wrong. Pastry chef Alice Medrich wrote this advice for Food 52. Brownies made with cocoa can have very deep chocolate flavour and still retain a softer and moister texture than an equally chocolatey brownie made with a bar of chocolate. How can that be? It's all because of the fat. When you use cocoa powder, you have to replace the fat that you would have gotten from the chocolate's cocoa butter with actual butter. The difference in these fats is that butter stays soft at room temperature, while cocoa butter firms up. When it comes to choosing between natural or Dutch processed cocoa powder, Cook's Illustrated confirms that baked goods made with the more acidic natural cocoa were drier, while those made with the less acidic Dutch were fudgier and made for an earthier, richer chocolate flavour. If you do choose to forego the cocoa powder and make chocolate brownies instead, you definitely want to be picky about the quality of the ingredient. Now, that doesn't mean splurging for the $20 per ounce artisan chocolate with gold leaf, but you'll want to skip the super cheap stuff too. Former Bon Appetit Senior Associate Editor Claire Saffitz had this to say: I wouldn't bake with an $11 artisanal bar. It should be delicious enough on its own to eat as a snack. Now, what about chocolate bars versus chocolate chips? Is there really any difference? There is, and it's a big one. While it might be easier to grab the bag of chips rather than painstakingly chopping a big bar of chocolate, the chips won't be doing your brownies any favours. That's because chips contain stabilisers and preservatives, which aside from impeding the melting process, can compromise the chocolate's flavour. While Saffitz recommends against baking with chips, she says that if you do, be sure to choose a high-quality product that contains fewer ingredients. We've all burned a baked good or two, the phone rings or the dryer dings, and the next thing you know there's smoke pouring out of the oven. But have you ever taken a batch of brownies out of the oven to test for doneness and then just plumb forgotten to put them back in? That's what one Epicurious writer did.
Why is there smoke coming out of your oven, Seymour?
That isn't smoke, it's steam.
Kemp Minifee says that when she realised her brownies had been left out of the oven for about 15 minutes, she popped them back in and hoped for the best. Surprisingly, the forgotten brownies were fudgier and far better than her usual recipe. Minifee consulted Harold McGee, author of On Food and Cooking, who explained why that might be. He said, the 15-minute respite is allowing both brownies and pan to cool down, so when you put them back in the oven, it takes some minutes for them to get back up to temperature before they can continue to cook and become more done. And the outer portions will end up less hot than they would with continuous cooking. In case you need an extra push to try this method, just know that famous chef Alton Brown co-signs and promises what he calls ooey gooey brownies. Fans of Ina Garten have no doubt heard the barefoot Contessa sing coffee's praises in the making of nearly all of her chocolate desserts. And there's a very good reason that she adds this secret ingredient. She said, if you add coffee to chocolate, it gives it a depth of flavour. Whether you use instant coffee granules like Garten or simply substitute coffee for water, you're doing your brownies a favour. Cooks Illustrated recommends adding 1.5 teaspoons of instant espresso powder per 9-inch by 13-inch batch of brownies and promises that it won't result in a distinct coffee taste, only amped up chocolate flavour. Adding brewed coffee might be even more important than boosting the chocolate flavour. It obscures the processed flavours. That's reason enough to start adding coffee to your brownies, isn't it? Anyone who's ever whipped up a batch of boxed brownies knows that all you need is an egg, vegetable oil and water. Now there's nothing wrong with vegetable oil. It's a fine oil for your brownie baking needs. But you're missing out on an easy opportunity to give your baked goods a little something extra if you never reach for a different fat. Olive oil, for instance, will impart its fruitiness and a delicious bitterness into brownies. Melted butter will result in a richer and chewier brownie than you'll get from vegetable oil. Coconut oil works well in brownies too. You can also substitute vegetable oil with more unexpected ingredients like Greek yogurt and avocado. One Spoon University writer tested both substitutions and found that mashed avocado resulted in rich and creamy brownies, while Greek yogurt produced a chocolatey and moist result and was the clear winner in her taste test. Plus, Greek yogurt makes us feel like we're eating healthy food. Win-win. Maybe you bought it new, maybe it was handed down from grandma, but either way, you've got a Pyrex baking dish, and it's probably the dish you reach for when you make casseroles and brownies alike. Keep right on baking your lasagna in it, but stop with the brownies already. Why? Pastry chef Stella Parks says there's only one right pan for baking brownies, and that's one made of lightweight, reflective metal like aluminum, she explained. Parks also said that a glass pan, like that trusty Pyrex you love so much, is so thick and heavy that it can take twice as long to cook your brownies through, and that can result in a finished product that's dense and gummy. Dark non-stick baking pans can result in brownies that bake too fast and are too brown on the bottom with dried out edges, which explains why most boxed mixes instruct you to lower the oven temperature if you're using one. Parks promises that an aluminum pan is your best bet for optimally puffed brownies that settle into fudgy, crinkly perfection. A common brownie making mistake is that you're not whipping your eggs and sugar well enough. It's called the ribbon stage, and Epicurious insists that it's a necessary evil when it comes to making better brownies. The ribbon stage is achieved by whipping the daylights out of the eggs and sugar to a point that when you lift your whisk up, the mixture is thick enough to ribbon back on itself. Obviously, this adds air into the mixture, which you'd think would be counterintuitive for fudgy brownies. And though the resulting brownies are indeed loftier than a batch made without taking this step, they were undeniably creamier on the inside and shinier on top. Yes, it takes a bit longer, but your effort will be rewarded. We get it. When a cake or brownie craving hits, you need to satisfy it as quickly as possible. Thanks to boxed mixes, that means you could be shoveling molten hot, fresh from the oven brownies into your mouth in 30 minutes flat. So why on earth would you want to waste 48 hours refrigerating your brownie batter? To make them taste even better, of course. It's a bit of magical brownie making advice from Alice Medricks, who includes this genius tip in her book, Seriously Bittersweet, The Ultimate Dessert Maker's Guide to Chocolate. Medrich explains that refrigerating the brownie batter in the pan for several hours or as long as 2 days before baking wreaks enormous transformations. It improves the top gloss and crustiness, and it also blends the flavors so that the brownies taste much richer and the texture is chewier too. All good reasons, no? Just remember to get the batter into your baking pan first. If you refrigerate the batter in a mixing bowl, the butter or cocoa butter will firm up far too much to be spreadable.
And you will not leave this platform until you have consumed the entire confection!
Entire confection?
No, not a slice of bread in the batter. That would just be weird. But introducing a slice of bread to your brownies after they've been baked is almost as important as baking them perfectly in the first place. If there's one bad thing that can be said about brownies, it's that they go stale almost as soon as you take them out of the oven. Okay, so maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the chocolatey squares definitely have the propensity to dry out, and fast. On the off chance that you're not going to inhale the entire pan of brownies within 12 hours, tossing a slice of bread into the storage container is a surefire way to keep those squares moist. Not only does it prevent them from drying out, but this bread trick can help revive already dried out brownies too. Just place as many slices of bread over the less than fresh squares as you need to cover them. Seal them up, and in 24 hours, you'll be sinking your teeth into a revitalized treat. This works because the brownies steal the moisture they need from the bread. And let's be honest, a few slices of sacrificial bread is well worth it for this payoff.
But I have made you brownies. I have made you brownies from scratch.
There are very few baked treats that are as tempting as cinnamon rolls, but you really have to know what you're doing to make them the right way.
There's nothing like waking up to my fresh-baked cinnamon rolls.
Have your cinnamon rolls been leaving everyone cold? Well, you might be doing something wrong. Here's how to make truly superior cinnamon rolls. When making cinnamon rolls, most people tend to unduly obsess about the dough. Will it rise in the oven? Could it possibly be too dense? What if it's not quite as flaky as it looks?
I'm baking up some cinnamon, feeling you'll be right back in. It's not just a sweet confection.
Truth be told, people often overlook the quality of the cinnamon they're using. According to food blogger Emily Ackerman, that's a big mistake. As she told Mashed, much of the cinnamon that is sold in chain grocery stores is not considered high quality. Ceylon cinnamon is perfect for desserts, and in this case, it's perfect for the best tasting cinnamon rolls. Trust us on this one, you have good reason to take this advice to heart.
This reason is covered in cream cheese icing.
When it comes to cooking cinnamon rolls, yeast might seem inconsequential. After all, most recipes call for a rather small amount of the stuff, right? Well, as it turns out, yeast plays a pretty essential role in the process, especially if you want your cinnamon rolls to achieve that deliciously light and fluffy texture. Yeast also helps your rolls achieve that perfect puffiness and dome-like shape. As Cinnabon corporate chef Jennifer Holwill told Mashed, be sure to keep water or milk temperature below 140 Fahrenheit, or if you're without a thermometer, be able to comfortably stick your finger in the liquid if you are baking at home. This will help ensure that you don't kill the yeast, which itself ensures that you'll have an absolutely delicious cinnamon roll when all is said and done. Hey, why not treat yourself to some of this homemade goodness right now? You deserve it.
What better way to unwind than by enjoying a hot, fresh, grand cinnamon roll?
When you're making homemade cinnamon rolls, you should definitely take the ambient air humidity and temperature into account. After all, baking loaves of bread with yeast is as much a science as it is an art, and the same goes for cinnamon rolls. Mashed talked to Jessica Randhawa, the head chef behind food website The Forked Spoon. She offered us this pearl of culinary wisdom. When proofing the dough, if the room is too hot or humid, the dough could rise at an accelerated pace, causing the rolls to dip. According to Randhawa, cinnamon rolls can take longer to ferment if the room is cold and dry. In turn, this will result in denser rolls that just don't rise to their desired potential. To make things even more complicated, humidity factors usually aren't touched upon in cinnamon roll recipes. As Randhawa explains, this is why having a thermometer and humidity sensor near the dough when proofing will help bring scientific facts back into the dough-making process for a better homemade cinnamon roll outcome. So now you know.
Watching them rise, then what a surprise!
Dad?
Cinnamon rolls.
See them disappear.
Cinnamon rolls call for rich ingredients like butter and eggs, so make sure you don't cut any corners when choosing your ingredients. At the end of the day, quality is absolutely key here. We talked to Jocelyn Drexinger, who happens to be the owner of New Hampshire bakery Mint and Marlow. She told Mashed, "I always recommend using products from free-range, humanely raised animals that live on small family farms. Using farm-fresh, free-range eggs will translate to a more flavorful, deeply colored yolk and therefore a tastier cinnamon roll. On top of that, slow-churned butter produced from grass-fed cows will also add a more complex and robust flavor to your rolls. If you can find an 84% butterfat option, even better." We simply can't wait to put these helpful pointers to the test. We bet it's going to make our cinnamon buns really hit the spot.
They can smell the cinnamon, they're on their way.
We love grand cinnamon rolls.
Here's a potential problem. Are your cinnamon rolls too doughy? According to Jenny Field of Pastry Chef Online, that might be because you packed them in the pan too tightly. As she explains to Mashed, this results in them getting super crowded as they rise and sometimes pushing up like volcanoes while they bake, making them doughy and dense in the centers. Fortunately, this problem can be easily remedied the next time you decide to make yourself some cinnamon rolls. As Field explains, avoid this by giving pull-apart cinnamon rolls a good 1 inch of space all around, and more if you like standalone cinnamon rolls. Bake standalones on a sheet tray with 2 to 2.5 inches between the rolls. Bake pull-aparts in a standard 9 by 13 inch pan with 1/2 inch to 1 inch of space between each roll. Just follow these simple directives and make cinnamon rolls that are simply sensational.
Cinnamon rolls! Get them while they're hot, hot, hot! Go, 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 go! Get your cinnamon rolls! Yes! Go, 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 go!
Baking a cake is a lot of fun once you've nailed the basics. While there are lots of ways for cakes to fail, the steps for making a fabulous cake are easy to follow. Steer clear of common cake baking mistakes and you'll be on your way to sugary bliss. Despite what cake recipes would have you believe, baking a cake actually begins long before you preheat the oven. While many cake ingredients, from eggs to butter to milk, live in the fridge, it's essential to begin your cake recipes with room temperature ingredients. As Sally of Sally's Baking Addiction explains, it's easier to emulsify room temperature fat than cold fat. Room temperature butter creams better into sugar, and room temperature eggs hold air bubbles better, lending a lighter, airier texture to baked goods. Cold eggs also risk shocking your other ingredients, curdling the fat and giving you a far from appetizing texture in your batter. So before you begin your recipe, about an hour ahead of time, pull all your ingredients together. Not only will this encourage you to have all your ingredients ready to go, but you'll ensure that all of your ingredients are at the perfect temperature, room temperature.
You're the ogre.
Yes, but I bake great cakes.
While you're assembling your ingredients and bringing all of your cold cake ingredients to room temperature, be sure to check the expiration date of your leavener. Leavening agents like baking powder, baking soda, and yeast do go bad, and while using them after they expire isn't as dire as, say, expired eggs, which could be hazardous to your health, it can keep your cakes from rising properly. Baking powder usually lasts about 18 months in the cupboard, but if you're ever not sure, there's a simple test you can do to make sure it's still potent enough to help your cake gain that ideal fluffy texture. Iowa State University Extension and Outreach suggests mixing a teaspoon of baking powder into 1/3 of a cup of warm water. If the mixture bubbles, it's still good to use. There is something to be said for a detail-oriented mentality in baking, specifically when it comes to measuring. Unlike in cooking, where a touch less salt or a bit more butter won't usually change the integrity of a dish, in baking, every gram counts. Literally. While most American baking recipes use volume-based measures like cups and tablespoons, there's a reason why many European recipes and most American pastry pros use weight-based measures like grams. Investing in a small kitchen scale is a great way to make your cakes more consistent, but if you'd rather continue to use volume measures, it's essential to at least learn how to measure properly and avoid common measuring mistakes. According to Sally's Baking Addiction, the best way to measure flour is using the spoon and level method. To do this, use a spoon to scoop flour out of a bag, jar, or bowl and into your measuring cup without packing it down. Once you've reached the top of the cup, level any surplus back into the bag or jar. You'll end up with a far more accurate measurement. We've all fallen victim to laziness in the kitchen when it comes to sifting. After all, sifting the dry ingredients means one more thing to wash, and it certainly couldn't make that much of a difference on the final cake, right? Wrong. Neglecting to sift your dry ingredients is a huge cake baking mistake. If you fail to sift the flour, this can lead to lumps in the batter and prevent your cake from rising properly in the oven. It also might result in pockets in your batter and in your final cake. Sifting also allows you to get an accurate measurement. If a recipe calls for 1 cup of sifted flour, this is a far different amount than if you'd use 1 cup of packed flour. It's also a great way to ensure that all of your dry ingredients are well incorporated with one another, which can help you avoid overmixing your batter. So do yourself and your cake a favour. Don't skip this essential step. Undermixing cake batter can occur at multiple steps in the baking process. To undermix at the last stage of mixing means you may have streaks or even clumps of flour, which is usually the last ingredient added to cake batter in your final mix. This can lead to a lumpy or floury finished cake. Depending on the kind of cake you're making, you may also run the risk of undermixing at an earlier stage, especially if you need to cream butter and sugar together, or beat egg whites until they're fluffy and provide support for the final structure of a genoise or angel food cake. As a rule of thumb, you only really need to worry about overmixing once a gluten-containing flour like rye or wheat is added. In earlier stages, make sure you mix until the desired texture is reached before moving on to the next step. If you've been patient and mixed well at each of these stages and taken the care to sift your flour to remove any lumps, it should be pretty difficult to undermix the batter at the last stage. Whether a recipe calls for a 12-inch loaf pan, an 8-inch round cake pan, or a bundt pan, be sure you don't go off script. Cake recipes render a certain volume of batter, and the recipe developer will have tested it using the pan they recommend. Using too big or too small a pan can lead to overflow or uneven baking, and using a different shaped pan than the one called for might mean the baking time isn't what the recipe promises. Also, different materials, from aluminum to glass to cast iron, conduct heat in different ways. Choosing the right material for your baking pan is essential for a successful cake. There's a reason that recipes call for preheating the oven before you do anything else. Unlike bread, which needs to rest before baking, cakes are designed to be baked immediately. This comes down to the way that chemical leaveners work. Baking powder and baking soda react with the other ingredients in the cake batter, causing a chemical reaction that helps the cake to rise. You know that volcanic eruption experiment you did with baking soda and vinegar in school? Wait, this is a little too dramatic. Yeah, this is the one. And like that volcanic eruption, you can't make the chemical reaction wait for you. As the experts at Nigella explain, once a cake batter is made, it must be put in the oven immediately so that it sets during the reaction, not after. Otherwise, the cake may begin to set only after the reaction has taken place. The result will be a dense fallen cake with none of the airy texture you're looking for. While similar, baking powder works slightly differently than baking soda, in that it causes two chemical reactions. One, like baking soda when it's mixed with the liquid ingredients, and another when heated. A baking powder batter may thus be slightly more forgiving of delayed baking than one made with baking soda alone. Either way, the sooner you get it in the oven, the sooner you can eat cake. As your cake bakes, it will begin to release the most incredible aroma, but resist the urge to peek until your cake is done. Opening the oven door to check out your baking cake releases some of the heat, which can cause the oven temperature to drop. This may mean that you inadvertently extend the cooking time of your cake, and if you follow the recipe instructions, you risk underbaking it. This can lead to the cake being too damp in the middle or even falling. Even if you compensate for your curiosity by baking your cakes a little bit longer, they may still fall if you peek due to the vibrations of the oven door closing. If you do peek at your cake while it bakes, it's essential to close the oven door slowly and carefully to prevent this. Then again, it's probably better to resist the urge entirely. Look, we get it. No one wants their cake to turn out burned or dry, and since the tops of cakes often brown early on during their time in the oven, it can be really tempting to assume that a cake is cooked through before it really is. Your best bet in ensuring that you're taking a cake out at the right time is to use a cake tester. But if you still manage to underbake your cake, luckily there are a few solutions. Returning it to the oven, covering it with foil if it's too browned on the outside but underdone within, is perhaps the best solution. You may also want to reduce the oven temperature to help it cook through more evenly. But Leaf notes that if your cake has already collapsed, you can actually scoop the uncooked batter out of the middle of the cake and transfer it to a new pan to bake separately. Your cake may not look the way you expected it to, but it'll still taste great. A lovely golden brown colour is usually the ideal sign that your cake is cooked through. But what if the cake was brown from the get-go? Whether you're making a delightful chocolate sponge or a rich tunnel of fudge cake, chocolate cake to its perfect doneness is an art form, and many are the home bakers who have accidentally overcooked a chocolate cake because they didn't realise it was done until too late. Luckily, King Arthur's flour offers a few tips to cooking chocolate cake to perfection. The edges of the cake will have pulled away from the pan, the top of the cake will transition from shiny to matte, and the surface of the cake will spring back when touched lightly.
Here's the deal, just little pieces, and you don't tell Mommy about the movie, and I don't tell her about the cake, okay?
You've been patiently waiting for your cake to emerge from the oven, so of course the second it comes clean from the pan, you're ready to frost it and dig in. Unfortunately, if you really want a beautiful final result, you're going to have to wait a little longer. Frosting a hot or even warm cake is a recipe for disaster. Don't make this frosting mistake. Most frostings, from buttercream to cream cheese, rely on a fat that is solid at room temperature, but liquid when warmed. This means that if you apply such a frosting to a still warm cake, the fat in the frosting will melt, causing it to slide right off the cake. Give your cake ample time to cool all the way through before attempting to level, stack, and frost. Ideally, it should be cool to the touch. It requires a bit of patience, but you'll have a much prettier result. Frosting should be applied in 2 coats. The first coat is called the crumb coat, and it serves an essential role that should be evident from its name. This frosting catches and contains any crumbs that come loose from the cake, ensuring that the final coat is smooth and pristine. But that's not all. Cake expert Lindsay of Sprinkles for Breakfast explained, "A crumb coat can also help you fill in spots where your cake might not be totally even, like gaps between layers or even jagged edges. It's sort of the last tool you have in your toolbox to help you overcome any missteps and ensure the final cake looks as beautiful as possible." After crumb coating your cake, you'll want to chill it for 15 to 30 minutes to allow this layer to set before adding the final layer of icing and any decorations. From bringing all of your ingredients to room temperature, to baking your cake for just long enough to letting it cool, to chilling the crumb coat, cake baking is a time-consuming venture, and it can be a really fun one, provided you give yourself the time to proceed through these steps stress-free. As anyone who's tried to bake a cake the morning of a big dinner party can attest, baking with a deadline can be super stressful. This is why you might want to do at least some of the work the day before. Both cake layers and frostings can be made a day or two in advance and stored tightly wrapped or sealed until ready to use. You can even make and crumb coat your cake a day in advance and wrap it in plastic until you're ready to apply the final layer of icing and any decorations.
Making a batch of cookies is such a popular home baking project, but there are plenty of ways you can end up sabotaging your cookies. Here are the mistakes everyone makes when baking cookies. Don't fall for them. Bake your cookies right and eat them too. At the beginning of nearly every cookie recipe, the first step is to cream the butter and sugar together. This is also referred to as creaming and is an integral step in cookie recipes. The first minute or so of creaming just brings the ingredients together, with it resembling dense, wet sand. After a few more minutes, you're likely to notice that your buttercup yellow butter mixture is starting to lighten. The ingredients will begin to expand, and the friction from beating will begin to cream the butter and sugar together. According to Stella Parks, pastry chef and cookbook author at Serious Eats, 5 minutes of creaming is about how long you should shoot for to achieve the perfect texture. During the creaming process, what you're essentially doing is incorporating air into your cookies, which translates to lighter and fluffier cookies. The aeration allows the cookies to expand in the oven, giving the baking powder or soda you used a path to expand their gases. When you're cooking dinner, you may be tempted to add a little bit of salt here and some extra butter there, letting your creativity flow with the progress of the meal. And for many savory dishes, that's a perfectly acceptable way to cook, if not preferred. Baking, on the other hand, is a science, and assuming the recipe you're using was written and tested by an experienced baker, chances are you should follow it as closely as possible. Using the right measuring tools and following the recipe exactly are the first steps to baking the perfect cookies. Is there really a difference between a half teaspoon and a whole teaspoon of baking soda? There is, and it could make or break your chocolate chip cookies. Before getting started, take a little time to learn how to properly scoop your flour, learn the different uses for wet and dry measuring cups, and maybe even invest in a kitchen scale to make sure you're measuring the exact amount of ingredients every time. As you're reading the instructions for your cookies, you see a note saying you're supposed to use room temperature butter, but your butter is still chilling in the fridge. What is room temperature anyway? According to pastry chef and cookbook author Claire Saffitz, room temperature is about 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll notice your butter is in the sweet spot when you can spread it easily or stick your finger into it without resistance. Room temperature butter is ideal for creaming in a cookie recipe because it's going to be easier to aerate, making for a better textured cookie overall. It's also going to be easier on your mixer, which will have to do less work to break the butter down. While you're pulling your butter out of the fridge, go ahead and pull the eggs out too. Taking the chill off the eggs will help them aerate faster as well and make them easier to mix into the dough. If you've forgotten to pull your butter out early, consider cutting your butter up into smaller pieces before measuring anything else out to warm up faster. As far as we're concerned, there are two types of bakers in the world: bakers who scrape down the bowl and bakers who don't.
What, like it's hard?
Not scraping down the bowl puts you firmly in the amateur baker category, which is easily remedied with a quick swish of a bowl scraper or rubber spatula at a few key points during the mixing process. Typically, you'll scrape the ingredients that have stuck to the sides and bottom of the bowl after creaming, during and after adding eggs, and once or twice while adding flour and additional liquid ingredients. This simple step is worth it when every cookie comes out with impressive uniformity. The masters at King Arthur Baking Company point out that even if the recipe doesn't explicitly call for scraping the bowl down, it's best practice to do it anyway. If you don't, you might have unevenly mixed dough, which can result in the last few cookies baking completely different than the first cookies scooped from the batch. Many baking recipes miss the one ingredient that can truly bring out all of the flavors and sweetness together. It's not egg yolks, a specialty spice, or even more sugar. It's salt. While a little sea salt on top of a chocolate chip cookie may not seem like an amazing idea, it's actually the secret ingredient that will probably make it better than any chocolate chip cookie you've had before. HuffPost explains that salt gives our bodies a boost when it comes to processing the sweetness of sugar. A philosophical way to look at it is this: you'll never fully appreciate the sweetness of your cookies until you add a little salt to the mix.
Sweet and salty.
You can achieve a nice salted cookie effect by using a little salted butter in the recipe, upping the amount of salt, or sprinkling a little sea salt on top of the cookies before baking. If you've ever had cookies stick to a baking sheet only to crumble when trying to scoop them off, you probably already understand why parchment paper is a necessity when baking cookies. But providing a non-stick surface for your cookies to bake on is really just one of the benefits of using parchment paper. While aluminium foil guarantees that your cookies won't stick to the tray, there's a chance that you'll still have to peel shards of foil off the back of your cookies. Cookies are far less likely to stick to parchment paper. Just don't confuse it with wax paper, which is lightly coated with silicone. Parchment paper also provides a thin layer of insulation to help evenly distribute heat from the pan when baking, making for cookie bottoms that are nicely golden brown instead of overcooked. For roll-out cookie dough, consider rolling the dough on lightly floured parchment paper instead of the countertop. You've probably noticed on the back of a brownie mix that it says to shorten your bake time if using a dark pan. That's because dark pans absorb more heat and cook faster than lighter pans. When using a dark non-stick baking sheet, you run the risk of burning your cookies by overheating them or scorching the bottom of the cookie before the rest of the cookie has had enough time to bake. If all you've got is a dark non-stick cookie sheet, Taste of Home recommends baking your cookies on a silicone baking mat to help insulate and distribute the heat. We don't recommend turning your oven temperature down because that will affect the overall rise of your cookies.
Instead, if your heating element is at the bottom of the oven, try putting the cookies on a higher rack to promote more even cooking from both the top and bottom.
Even if you've done everything right during the cookie mixing process, there's still a chance that the cookie dough all the way at the bottom of the bowl won't have the same amount of mix-ins as the dough in the rest of the bowl. As the kitchen wizards at Cooks Illustrated point out, it's a common conundrum to discover that the cookies scooped towards the end are as full of mix-ins as those from the first batch. But if you follow this simple step, you'll make those last few cookies just as amazing as the first few. The secret? Keep a handful of mix-ins to the side, so when you get to the bottom of the bowl, you can fortify the rest of the dough. Everyone's got an opinion on what makes the perfect cookie. Some people can't resist crispy cookies with a snap, while others insist that a gooey and chewy cookie is what a cookie should be. Sometimes the recipe has a lot to do with the outcome of the cookies. For many cookies, though, the bake time has a good deal to do with the final texture of the cookie. You'll notice that many recipes tend to have a specific baking temperature and then a range of time they should be baked in. Southern Living advises that in most cookie cases, chocolate chip anyway, cookies are golden brown on the edges, yet still soft in the middle at around the 10-minute mark. At this point, you can either take the cookies out and let them finish cooking on the baking sheet, or leave them in the oven for a few more minutes. All cookies are relatively soft right after baking, but once they're cooled, you'll see how crisp they manage to get in the oven. With that in mind, if your cookies come out a little crunchier than you'd like, try baking them a couple of minutes less to achieve the perfect texture. You may be tempted to put as many balls of cookie dough on a baking sheet that you can in an effort to get as many fresh cookies on the table as quickly as possible. But leaving room in between your cookies has a few benefits. Most cookies spread to some degree while baking. Leaving at least 2 inches of space between each cookie ensures that when the cookies spread, they won't run into each other. Of course, cookies that smash into each other while baking still taste pretty great, but they're not that attractive to look at.
Well, that sucks.
Additionally, leaving room between the cookies will allow heat to evenly distribute around each of the cookies for an even bake. It might seem like an innocuous baking mistake to make, but baking at a lower temperature than the recipe calls for may lead to some issues. Most cookies are leavened with baking powder or baking soda, which is activated when it heats up. The faster the leavener heats up, the better rise your cookies will have. At a lower temperature, your cookies may not rise appropriately or may rise and then fall after baking. Most people don't intentionally set their ovens too low. The best way to judge the temperature is to put a reliable oven thermometer inside the oven so you can easily read it. If you do a lot of baking, you have probably noticed which sides or corners of your oven are hotter than others. It's most apparent when baking a sheet cake and one side of the tray gets darker before the other side. There's also a vertical heat difference between the bottom and top racks, depending on where the heat source is in the oven. The best way to thwart uneven heating is to rotate your sheet tray while baking. About halfway through baking, rotate the sheet tray 180 degrees. If you're only baking one sheet, place the tray on the center rack of the oven. If you're baking several sheets, you'll get the most ideal heat dispersion by moving the bottom tray to the top rack and the top tray to the bottom rack. We know how difficult it is to let cookies cool when they've just come out of the oven, but we'd suggest letting the cookies cool for 5 to 10 minutes before digging in. A cooling rack is ideal here for a very important reason. Cooling cookies on a rack allows for more airflow around the cookies and cools them off more quickly. Cookies left on a hot cookie sheet will continue to cook for several minutes even after coming out of the oven. If you've baked your cookies on a piece of parchment paper, it's easy to pick up the paper from a short side of the tray and slide the whole sheet onto your cooling rack. If you don't have a cooling rack, consider taking your cookies out of the oven a minute or so earlier to finish cooking on the hot sheet tray. During the holidays, many people find themselves churning out cookies for gift boxes, work parties, and family gatherings. Times like these may leave you with more cookie dough than cookie sheets, constantly rotating sheets in and out of the oven in batches. Even though you've got a lot of baking to do, you should think twice before plopping fresh dough onto a hot sheet. When immediately reusing a hot sheet tray, cookies begin to melt before they have a chance to rise. This makes for cookies that bake flatter and spread further than the same cookies baked on a cool cookie sheet. If you're short on cookie trays and time, at least let your trays cool for 5 minutes before popping them back in the oven with more cookies. Not all cookie doughs are created equal. While some cookie dough is meant to be scooped out of the bowl directly onto a baking tray and sent straight to the oven, others need time to chill out before baking. According to Martha Stewart, rolled and cut out cookies should absolutely be chilled before baking. When chilling these types of cookie doughs, you should refrigerate them for at least 30 minutes and up to 24 hours before baking. Of course, not all cookie doughs should be chilled. Thin, crispy tuile cookies are meant to spread while baking, and dense cookies won't benefit from absorbing more moisture in the refrigerator.
Mushy apples, sloppy filling, bad butter. There are so many wrong ways to make an apple pie.
I'm so nervous, I'm shaking in me wellies.
Perhaps the most common mistake people make is using the wrong type of apples. While they all have their pros and cons, there are a few varieties that are seemingly incompatible with this baked classic. For starters, you want tart apples, so they balance the flavors from added sweeteners. But there are other elements in play as well. While Macintosh fit the bill on the tartness, they're no good for baking. They offer a softer bite and won't hold up well in the oven, where the heat will turn them into mush. Instead, you'll want fruit with firm flesh that won't collapse under high heat, so Gala and Red Delicious apples are a big no-no. Another feature to look out for is juiciness. While these types of apples make for a wonderful snack on their own, they can turn your filling into a soupy mess when used in pies. You're better off choosing varieties with a low juice content, like Golden Delicious, Piñata, Granny Smith, and Rome Beauty apples.
Well, what are we waiting for? Let's pick some apples.
No one likes cutting into a pie with runny filling. Not only does it destroy the looks of the dessert, it also messes with the flavor. Even worse, you'll end up with something more like apple pie soup. Science of Cooking notes that thickeners add viscosity and body to your food without altering other properties. These additions work by binding to water molecules and absorbing all the moisture. And every baker's pantry is sure to be stocked with cornstarch. It works faster than flour and forms a smooth, clear filling. That is, at least according to one baker you might know, Martha Stewart.
Oh, good pie.
You can also add tapioca, flour, arrowroot starch, and potato starch, and agar-agar is another good option. Baking Needs also recommends using instant pudding mix as a thickener. Besides improving the overall consistency, adding the dry powder also kicks up the flavor. The world is your oyster, but most home bakers go for vanilla to knock that pie out of the park. An award-winning pie demands the perfect crust, balanced and buttery, flaky but fall off your fork tender, and it should be a beautiful golden brown that showcases the apple filling. It turns out the perfect crust comes down to one important ingredient: good old butter. Butter can be tricky to work with, especially when it comes to achieving the right temperature for pastries, so be sure to incorporate chilled butter when making your dough. Warm butter will harden the dough and make it more challenging to work with, resulting in a tough crust.
It's good.
Happily, chilled butter helps your baked pastry to puff. Once you've rolled and folded your dough, those bits of butter create pockets of air in the oven under the heat, resulting in that melt-in-your-mouth flaky crust. Still, according to Quartz, you don't want the butter to be too cold either, because it will be impossible to mix. The next time you're in a hurry and leave dough out on the counter, think again. This might jeopardize the entire integrity of your crust. It will come out soggy and soft and won't be able to hold the pie filling together.
You know how hard it is to make an apple pie?
Back to that cold butter thing. If you don't chill your dough in the fridge, the butter in it will start to melt, and instead of rising in the oven, it will collapse. As the New York Times notes, the dough needs to stay chilled in order to remain firm when it goes in the oven. Plus, chilled dough is easier to roll out because the gluten has had time to relax. After that, just form the dough into a ball, wrap it in airtight plastic, and let it rest for 2 hours in the fridge. If your pie typically has a hard and crumbly crust, chances are you overworked the dough. You only really have to knead it lightly until it's smooth. According to Culinary Choice, overworking forms gluten. And while it's excellent for baking bread, it's bad news for pastries. The result will be a disappointing crust with a hard, chewy texture that falls apart in your hands and possibly ruins your hopes and dreams.
Don't overhandle. You want to be right on the verge of crumbling at any moment.
But you can easily tell if the dough is over-kneaded just by touching it to see if it's hard and tight. When rolling, it won't stretch, and instead, it breaks apart. Overworking typically occurs when your dough is sticky, and you likely end up rolling it too much because the dough keeps sticking to the rolling pin. Cookbook author Erin McDowell recommends chilling the dough and rolling it with additional flour to balance the excess liquid so it doesn't stick, according to Food 52. You can also try the timeless method of rolling the dough between 2 pieces of parchment paper. Probably the worst-case scenario when baking a pie is nothing short of a horror scene. The filling has secretly shrunk, but the crust remains looking like it's still a great pie. And unbeknownst to anyone, there's a disappointing gap between the filling and the crust. It's a total bummer to find out too late that you forgot to slice some air vents. Erin McDowell notes that your crust needs to be vented to avoid the dreaded pie gap. As your dessert bakes in the oven, the apples shrink and create a void full of hot air. The best way to avoid this is by cutting vents into the top layer. So, as the filling shrinks, the top crust settles as it bakes, and the steam has a chance to escape. You can use a fork or a knife to do the work. Make roughly 4 to 5 slits that are 2 inches apart, and just widen the gap with your fingers if needed. If you want to go full Instagram-worthy, you can try a pastry cutter to create cute geometric shapes like stars, hearts, flowers, and diamonds. When it comes to your bake, there are 2 ways to go about it. You can use raw apples, or you can cook them first. While both methods yield plate-licking results, raw apples are more notorious for the pie gap. According to the Detroit Free Press, raw apples shrink down in the oven as they cook, and as they decrease in volume, this allows air to get trapped between the crust and the filling. But cooking your apples beforehand means no shrinkage once the pie hits the oven. As Gordon Ramsey explains it, the secret to a great pie lies in caramelizing the apples with sugar and cinnamon before adding them to the crust. And hey, if it's good enough for Gordon Ramsay, it's definitely good enough for us. People, size matters here. And if you don't cut your apples evenly, you're setting yourself up for failure right from the start. Beside the fact that different sizes could ruin the texture, they will also destroy the overall look. And who wants to spend all this time baking just to end up with a lumpy pie?
We'll just tell your mother that we ate it all.
Odd-sized apples won't cook at the same rate. The smaller pieces cook faster, and the larger ones may even stay raw. Granted, peeling and slicing a bunch of apples is a task, but Shelley from Frugal Family Home explained the easy way to do it. Start by cutting off the top of the apple. Next, peel your apples in a circular motion. Then, cut 4 large chunks close to the core. Lastly, slice the apples to about 1/4 inch thick. You can even use a vegetable slicer to do the job. After that, you're good to go. Of course, flaky crust recipes call for butter, but you might want to swap in an alternative instead. Whether you're out of the real stuff or want to try a new method, it's important not to use the wrong type of fat for pie dough. According to Cooking Light, if you swap real butter with vegetable shortening, you'll likely be delightfully surprised by the results. Although you'll get a dough that's a little darker than its butter-based counterpart, you'll still get that flaky bite. Plus, since shortening has little to no taste, it won't affect the flavor profile.
Pie crust and an apple. Apple pie!
On the other hand, vegan shortening can have a strong plant-like flavor and be crumbly in texture, so you're better off avoiding it altogether. Unrefined coconut oil adds a strong flavor to the dough, but it does lead to a nice golden crust. Meanwhile, palm oil is definitely not a great option due to its unpleasant flavor. Plus, the dough becomes really hard to work with and requires a lot of water. If you've been trying to figure out why your apple pie is always burnt or undercooked when you take it out of the oven, you might be baking it on the wrong rack. While you might assume that the middle rack is a neutral zone and a safe bet, when it comes to pie, there is only one spot to put it, and it's not at the top where it will get scorched.
This must be where pies go when they die.
Since most of the crust is situated at the base of the dessert, you want the heat from the bottom of the oven to thoroughly cook the dough. This is why you should reach for a lower rack. According to Cook for Folks, a glass dish on the bottom rack bakes a beautiful golden crust. And if your crust is browning or burning from the bottom, you can always move the pie up a level or two. The best part about baking a pie is cutting it into perfect slices and eating it. But imagine the horror when the bottom is soggy and your apple pie immediately starts falling apart. Well, fret not, fellow dessert lovers. There's a simple solution. All you have to do is brush the bottom of your crust with an egg whitewash. While brushing the top of baked goods is relatively common, an egg whitewash is also the perfect solution to preventing a soggy bottom.
Had to show off my flaky bottom crust.
According to the Pioneer Woman, to make the wash, just whisk 1 tablespoon of water with an egg white until it's well combined. Then, use a silicone pastry brush to apply the mixture to your crust. Live Well Bake notes that the proteins from the egg whites work as a non-permeable barrier that prevents the moisture in the filling from making the crust soggy. Who doesn't want to dive right into a freshly baked pie? But good things come to those who wait, and it's imperative that you let the pie rest until it's cool. We promise it will be worth that extra time.
That's disgusting.
It's American.
As it turns out, it's not about the pie being too hot to handle. Instead, it's about allowing the filling a chance to cool down and set. If you dig in when it's piping hot, you'll be cutting into runny insides. A typical filling is loaded with sugar, which takes time to cool and become firm. And according to Cake Decorist, the pie should cool for at least 4 hours before slicing. Yeah, that's a long time to wait to taste your work. Thankfully, there's a faster way. You can also throw the pie in the fridge for at least 30 minutes before devouring a slice. That is, unless someone else gets to it first. By now, you might be thinking you know every possible tip and trick in the book. But wait, we've got one more. According to Martha Stewart, cold water is a must in order to bake a perfect flaky pie crust. We already know that it's essential to work with cold butter to create those pockets of air that puff up the crust. And similarly, ice water is also important since it interacts with both the fat and flour. First, by keeping the butter or shortening from melting, and second, by preventing gluten from developing. Double duty.
Nobody wanted seconds of my pie. Said the crust wasn't flaky.
If gluten develops in the dough, the crust will become too hard and chewy. And unlike warm water, cold water isn't so easily absorbed by the flour. This also prevents overhydration, which causes the pie to shrink in the oven. Plus, ice-cold water ensures that the dough remains tender. One Reddit user recommends keeping all your ingredients cold, including the butter and ice water, so you can roll out your best possible crust.
Chop, chop, time to get bacon. Daddy want pie.
Well, we can practically smell the warm apples and cinnamon coming from the kitchen. Looks like there's no question about what we're baking next.
Overdoing it with a certain ingredient is just one of the many crimes against casserole that many of us are guilty of. Here are all the reasons why no one is cheering for your casserole at the office potluck. Casseroles are an absolute favorite. What's not to like about creamy sauce and chunks of meat and vegetables? The dish is bursting with fresh flavors, which makes it a fulfilling meal to enjoy. But it's easy to forget one seemingly mundane element that can cost you a near-perfect casserole: greasing your baking dish. Yep, it's a simple mistake anyone can make, from a rookie home cook to a 5-star restaurant chef on a time crunch. You have to grease your casserole dish, especially if you want your food to be presentable. Not only does grease prevent food from sticking to the bottom, but it also allows you to easily and neatly remove each slice. Several items commonly found in the kitchen, like shortening, ghee, butter, and cooking oil, are good candidates. However, keep in mind that each ingredient yields different results. For instance, cooking spray is best for low-fat recipes, whereas butter can transfer its flavor to the food. Once you've selected your grease, it's time to slap it on your baking dish. Make sure you apply it to the entire surface, then sprinkle flour over the greased area. It's all sugar, spice, and everything nice until you make a mistake with salt while cooking. Overdoing it with salt can quickly overpower the other flavors in your casserole. Conversely, using too little can make it bland, so it's best to stick to the recipe measurements instead of winging it. If you have already added too much salt, don't worry, as a handful of kitchen remedies can rectify the mistake.
Oh, thank God.
One way is by adding an acidic element, like lemon juice or vinegar, to counterbalance the salty flavor. However, vinegar can easily clash with other ingredients, so an alternative such as tomato or tomato paste is a good way to tone down the salt. The second way is to add sugar to your casserole. Although sugar is not typically part of the ingredient list, it can be used to tweak salty flavors. You can also serve the dish with a condiment like sour cream, or add dairy products like heavy cream or cheese. Cheddar or Gouda are typically used in casseroles, so you can add a bit more to neutralize the salt. You can also add raw potatoes to absorb the excess salt, leaving you with a well-balanced casserole that'll have you begging for another bite. Every baked meal needs adequate time in the oven to achieve the desired golden brown perfection you're aiming for. Preheating your oven ensures that food is cooking at the right temperature. If you don't bring it to temperature ahead of time, chances are that you'll need to leave the dish in for longer than what's stated in the recipe. It's also beneficial to use a food thermometer to check your oven's temperature. Sometimes, this extra step might be the difference between the world's best casserole and an average tasting meal. Generally, it's a requirement to make food that is evenly baked throughout. This means no vegetables or chunks of meat are overcooked, cold, or underdone, and nothing smells burnt. Fluctuations in temperature occur in ovens that haven't been preheated, since it takes time for the appliance to reach the desired heat. The oven goes through a cycle of high and low temperatures as it stabilizes to the dial you have set. So the longer you preheat, the more accurate the actual temperature you'll be baking at. If you're not in the mood to eat a soggy, undercooked, or burnt mess, then give your oven a chance to preheat as you prepare your favorite casserole recipe. Cheese lovers stand by the belief that every cook should do their duty by putting cheese in everything. But the reality is, you can't. No matter how much you might want to, you can't toss just any old cheese you feel like into a casserole. For starters, you'll want to consider the other ingredients you're putting in the dish and what flavors you're seeking. There are specific cheeses that work best with certain items and the overall profile of the dish.
American cheese, cheddar cheese, pizza cheese.
Cheese brings a salty, fatty, and acidic component to any dish you add it to. You can add aged cheese like Parmigiano Reggiano, Pecorino Romano, cheddar, or Gouda for added complexity. If you're looking for a fresher taste, you can add creme fraiche or a tangy Boursin. If you're into the gooey kind of cheese that will melt in your mouth with a perfect amount of stretchiness, then you're better off picking mozzarella, Jack, Swiss, raclette, and fontina. Moreover, remember that hard cheeses need to be grated, whereas soft and semi-soft styles should be diced before being added to the casserole. For casseroles, your choices pan out to 3 baking dishes: metal or aluminum, glass, and ceramic. Of the 3, a metal baking dish is the poorest choice. It comes down to the fact that metal is a conductor, which means that it heats up and cools down fast. On the other hand, glass and ceramic pans are good insulators. They tend to heat up slowly and take their sweet time cooling down. Ergo, they are good options for keeping your food warm for a more extended period. It's hard to beat a plate of hot piping food, especially if it has cheese. Similarly, a casserole is best enjoyed straight out of the oven with steam wafting through the kitchen, attracting hungry diners. However, you can't have that outcome if you make your casserole in a metal pan, since the material snatches the opportunity of eating a hot meal. As the metal pan cools down, so does your delicious casserole. Opening your oven door just because you are curious about how the food is doing or simply can't wait until it's finished isn't going to make it cook any faster. If anything, it slows down the cooking process and could even ruin your casserole. The oven temperature can drop up to 50% when you open the door. This makes it fundamental to wait until you reach the minimum cooking time stated in the recipe, or you might end up having to bake it far longer. All the heat that was concentrated inside the oven working its magic to give you a perfectly delicious casserole now has a chance to escape. Furthermore, your oven has to work hard to get back to the desired temperature, starting the tedious process all over again. Be aware your senses can be a great resource to determine whether or not your baked goods or casseroles are done.
I smell something burning. Oh!
If your kitchen smells wonderful and the air is pleasantly rich with the aroma of a delicious casserole, then it's almost ready. You can also turn on the oven light to take a peek and use visual cues to estimate how much time is left. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we like to see it in the form of uniformly cut vegetables. Aesthetics aside, there's more than one reason to cut your vegetables evenly. Doing so is not only crucial to the success of a dish, but also ensures a better taste by allowing them to properly cook. There are a variety of different cutting techniques that you can use to cut your veggies down to size. Whichever one you choose, uniformly cut vegetables are likely to cook at the same rate. Vegetables are a great way to add texture to your casserole. However, imagine a carrot chunk in one bite and chewing on a minced piece in the next. This contrast of textures and consistency isn't the kind of clash you want in your dish. The pleasure of eating a delicious casserole is reduced if some bites are overcooked while others are raw and crunchy. So if you're looking to make a finger-licking delicious casserole, chop up your veggies the same size. This little bit of effort will go a long way in taking your dish to the next level. There's no doubt that adding herbs to a dish infuses it with exquisite flavors. Don't we all know someone with a secret ingredient, always an herb, that everyone wants to discover? Wouldn't we all like to add some herbal magic to our recipes too? However, knowing how to choose the right kind of herb for a particular dish is as essential as adding it. Rosemary, oregano, basil, parsley, and bay leaves are all options that go well with many casserole recipes. More importantly, we can't stress enough the importance of using fresh herbs as much as possible because their flavor often changes when they are dried, ultimately affecting the overall taste of the dish. If you really want to add a fresh element to your casserole, growing your own herb garden is definitely an option for a true farm-to-table experience. If that's not in the cards, most grocery stores carry a selection of fresh herbs. Once you start using them, you'll see they are a cheap and efficient route to making a dish stand out. Unless you're making a vegetarian menu, meat is the heart of any casserole. An experienced cook knows the little tricks that give a dish that extra kick of flavor. While most people may not think it's essential, searing the meat before incorporating the other ingredients will give your casserole an extra oomph that makes it stand out from the rest. The most effective way to brown meat without losing its nutritional juices is to sear it at a high temperature. Cooking it at a medium temperature results in a greater loss of meat juice, whereas cooking it at too high of a temperature will cause the juices to burn, losing all the rich flavors. It is imperative to get that balance just right in order to improve the taste of the casserole. If you're cooking big batches of casserole and have a large amount of meat to brown, avoid putting it in the pan all at once. Overcrowding it will make the meat too wet, ultimately beating the purpose of this step. In addition, be sure to reintegrate the juices from the meat that remain in the pan after searing, as they are the root of the overall flavor. Whether you're baking a cheesy potato casserole, loaded baked potato casserole, or any other recipe that uses the very versatile potato, you will have to first parboil them. Perhaps you've skipped this step in the past, unsure of what parboiling really is. Well, it's exactly what the name suggests, to partially boil something. Parboiling potatoes is an essential step in baking them. Otherwise, it takes an excessive amount of time to reach the desired softness and tenderness that is the mark of a quality cooked potato. If you use raw potatoes in your casserole, they will still cook in the oven, but the result will be different than if you boiled them first. Since they are already partially cooked when parboiled, the oven simply works to make them soft and moist. So if you desire a crunchy potato crust, parboiling your spuds is the way to go. You'll see why it's so important when you don't and end up taking a bite of overcooked vegetables and undercooked potatoes. Plus, parboiling actually speeds up the total cooking time, allowing your potatoes to cook in the same time frame as the other vegetables in your casserole. There's nothing more tedious than having to measure out all your ingredients. However, precision in baking is fundamental.
There is no room for error.
It takes a little effort to measure everything, but if you don't get it right, you can wave goodbye to a perfectly cooked casserole. For instance, if you were to add the wrong quantity of thickener by overdoing the flour to water ratio, you get a pasty texture, and the flour will leave behind a weird taste that could ruin the casserole's entire flavor. Not to mention, it will be a sticky mess. Moreover, flour overuse can cause your casserole to be hard and dry, making it inedible. Imagine it all going to waste. To avoid these outcomes, it's recommended to use graduated dry measuring cups designed to be filled and leveled to the brim when measuring dry ingredients. On the other hand, liquid measuring cups are labeled with volume marks. Getting your ingredients and proportions right is the best way to cook or bake any dish while avoiding a culinary disaster. Have you been using the wrong flour when baking biscuits? Does your butter cutter need sharpening? Are you slacking on your measuring? These are mistakes everyone makes when baking biscuits. Butter is one of the key ingredients of biscuits. Without it, biscuits would just be dry dough balls begging for some fat. Butter is what helps give pastries height, as well as a soft crumb and rich taste. When pieces of cold butter hit the oven, they melt, creating pockets of air that give you those beautiful, flaky layers in a biscuit. Incorporating cold butter into flour is appropriately called the biscuit method. To accomplish this, butter is added to the flour before any wet ingredients, and then cut into smaller and smaller pieces until the mixture takes on a mealy consistency and small pieces are visible. It it is important to make sure your butter pieces aren't too big. If they are, this can cause problems when the remaining ingredients are incorporated into the flour and butter. This will result in biscuits that are floury and filled with holes where that butter once was. Equally as detrimental to cutting the butter too large is cutting the butter too small. Cutting the butter too small can cause two main problems. The first is that you can inadvertently end up overworking the dough and create a tough biscuit. The other problem is that without those pea-sized chunks of butter, you aren't going to get beautiful, flaky layers. There will be no pockets of butter to melt. To avoid cutting the butter too small, it is generally suggested to stay away from cooking appliances such as electric mixers. These cream the butter rather than cut it, and that means they have no place in the biscuit world. It is generally considered better to cut in the butter manually. Food processors can be used, but should be monitored carefully so as not to overcut the butter. If you are concerned about the size of your butter chunks, one biscuit making hack to ensure the perfect size every time is to use a box grater to grate frozen butter right into your flour. This will result in pieces that aren't too big and aren't too small. While we are on the subject of butter, there is one more thing you should be aware of. Only cold butter should be used when making biscuits. Well-chilled or even frozen butter is ideal. The colder the better, really. Now's not the time for room temperature butter. We know what you're thinking.
How important is butter to this meal tonight?
The answer is very important. Using cold butter prevents it from incorporating into the dough before you want it to. Remember how we said that overmixing can create tough biscuits? Same with using room temperature butter. If the butter isn't cold when it goes into the oven, it won't be able to hold its shape to release those tiny pockets of steam, which give the biscuit those beautiful flakes. Instead, your biscuits will likely turn out something closer to a shortbread. Still delicious, but decidedly not a biscuit. To achieve a flaky pastry and crispy top, it should be cold butter all the way. The South is synonymous with buttermilk biscuits. Buttermilk isn't just there for show. It has a real purpose. It does double duty, both as a leavening agent to raise the roof of your biscuits and as a tenderizer, providing a soft, delicate crumb. That's because the acid in the buttermilk helps soften the gluten, the protein responsible for holding baked goods together. It is this acid that also reacts with baking soda to give more volume and rise. If you don't have buttermilk on hand, whole milk mixed with some vinegar or lemon juice works well as a substitute. And shockingly, if a bit gimmicky, mayonnaise can work as a secret ingredient in a tender biscuit, acting as both the acid and the fat. If you really don't have anything in your kitchen that could give a kick of acidity, you can try swapping out the baking soda with baking powder, though note that the amount needed will be different. You may think that bag of generic all-purpose flour in your pantry will make you good biscuits. Why wouldn't you? It is called all-purpose, isn't it? Well, the truth of the matter is that while you certainly could use it to make biscuits, it's far from ideal. Time and time again, tests of different brands have shown that while there are a lot of wrong flours, there is only one right flour to use for making biscuits. Cooking on the Side tested 3 different flours: Gold Medal all-purpose with baking powder and salt added, White Lily self-rising, and a store brand self-rising. All recipes took their test one step further, testing 6 different brands, including fan favorites such as Bob's Red Mill and King Arthur. They both came to the conclusion that the answer is White Lily. The biscuits made with this particular brand were soft and light and produced an excellent height. It is no wonder it is the brand of flour used exclusively in Chick-fil-A's famous biscuits. The reason comes down to basic science. White Lily is made with low-protein wheat, with a protein content of 11%, according to the company. NPR says a lower protein content prevents too much gluten from forming, keeping the biscuits tender and allowing the leavening agents to work their magic. You've got all your ingredients together, the butter is chilled and cut appropriately, and you have the best flour for biscuit making. Now it's time to put it all together. Don't mess up your perfect dough by mixing it incorrectly. First, you want to make sure not to undermix your ingredients. This should be easy enough to catch, because if the dough is undermixed, it will be crumbly and likely not hold together. As such, it will be noticeably difficult to roll out. Undermixing doesn't allow the liquid to evenly disperse, and it doesn't allow gluten bonds to develop in the pastry. Both of these properties contribute to the dough's ability to maintain its shape. If you notice your dough crumbling and not holding the way it should, try giving it a few more light mixes and see if that improves the texture. Of course, when it comes to mixing, there is absolutely too much of a good thing, and overmixing can be just as damaging to biscuit dough as undermixing. When a dough is overmixed, it can cause too much gluten development, which leads to tough, chewy biscuits. The dough will hold together a little too well, and the end result will not be the pleasant light biscuit that you want. Overmixing can also cause the butter to break down into smaller pieces and incorporate too much with the dough, leading to a whole host of problems. When it comes to biscuits, mix the bare minimum you can until all the ingredients are evenly incorporated, and then stop.
Would that it were so simple? Would that it were so simple? Keep your head still. Would that it were so simple? Would that it were so simple?
The way you cut your biscuits has a huge impact on the final result. A lot of people think it is straightforward. You grab your cutter of choice, press and twist, and out pops a perfectly circular biscuit ripe for the oven. Anyone who ever used Play-Doh can do it, right? Wrong. When cutting biscuits, the first thing you need is a sharp cutting tool. That's because a dull cutter is more likely to press and seal edges rather than cut straight through them. This is the same reason it isn't recommended that you use a cup or glass in place of a true cutter. When cutting, you also want to ensure the cutter is going straight down and back up again. No twisting. Twisting your cutter will also cause the dough to seal, preventing your biscuits from rising correctly. Look, we know it's tempting. The biscuit dough is cut, but now you have this patchwork of shredded dough. You want to re-roll it and make more. No delicious biscuit dough should go to waste, but you must resist the temptation. Re-rolling dough more than once or twice can lead to a number of problems. As you roll, the gluten bonds form and tighten, and you could end up with increasingly tough dough with each work of that pin. If you are dead set against throwing any biscuit dough away, there are a couple options. The Spruce Eats recommends, instead of rolling and cutting, simply shaping biscuits by forming dough balls. If you prefer to cut them with a traditional cutter, the kitchen recommends freezing any leftover scraps and adding them to soups and stews later down the line as a quick and easy dumpling substitute. You can also just cook those scraps in their misshapen state. They may look funky, but they will taste delicious. Again, using chilled ingredients when making biscuits is really important. One biscuit making secret even involves chilling the flour beforehand and doing your best not to touch the dough with your hands, lest they warm up the dough. You can avoid issues like this by doing one simple thing: chilling your dough before baking. According to King Arthur Flour, simply pop your baking sheet with your cut dough into the fridge and let it chill for a bit. This will allow the gluten to relax and give you a softer dough, and it will also give any butter that is softened time to re-solidify. It's a win-win. But wait, if biscuit dough should be refrigerated, does that mean you can freeze it? It sure does. Biscuit dough freezes beautifully. According to Taste of Home, simply place your cut biscuit dough on a baking sheet and freeze. Once the dough is frozen into pucks, put them inside a freezer bag for use later when a hankering for fresh-made biscuits strikes you. When it comes time to bake, you don't even need to thaw them. Just put them in the oven and add an additional 5 to 10 minutes to the suggested baking time. As Mr. Freeze would say,
"All right, everyone, chill."
biscuits bake best at a higher temperature than a lot of other baked goods. While cookies are generally happy at 350 degrees, biscuits baked at that temperature would likely be floppy and flat. According to Southern Kitchen, biscuits need a high heat, at least 425 degrees minimum, so that the butter and buttermilk release steam, causing the biscuits to rise. Without that steam, you aren't going to get a tall biscuit. While we're at it, it is probably a good idea to check the internal temperature of your oven. As Handle the Heat points out, even if your oven is reading a certain temperature, it may still be running low. According to Bon Appetit, oven temperatures can be off by as much as 75 degrees. Luckily, there is an easy way to check on your oven. An inexpensive oven thermometer can help ensure the correct temperature and a perfect bake in your oven every time. Measurements seem straightforward, but when it comes to flour, it really isn't. If a recipe calls for a weighted measurement of flour, it is worth investing in a digital kitchen scale in order to get the weight correct. That said, many recipes call for cup measurements of flour. The problem is, if you don't measure your cup correctly, you could end up with way too much flour in your mix. When the Spruce Eats tested flour measuring methods, they found that improperly scooped flour could add up to 20% more flour to a recipe. That is a big difference. According to Love & Lemons, the best way to measure flour accurately, aside from weighing, is to use a spoon. Fluff your flour using the spoon to get rid of any clumping or density. Then use the spoon to lightly scoop the flour into your measuring cup. Do not press down or pack your flour in any way. When the measuring cup is full, use the flat back of a knife to level off the measuring cup, and you should be left with a perfect cup of flour. Before you reach for that electric mixer to make biscuits, stop. Using either a stand-up mixer or a handheld mixer is a surefire way to deflate your biscuits. When making biscuits, we aren't looking to cream the butter as for cookies or cakes. Instead, we want to cut the butter into the dough. When you use an electric mixer like you would when creaming butter and sugar, not only will it warm up the butter, leading to dense results, but the dough is also more likely to become overworked, leading to tough biscuits. If you would still prefer to cut in the butter using an electric device, reach for the food processor instead. Cooks Illustrated notes that using a food processor can help you achieve a perfectly blended, evenly risen biscuit. First, use the food processors to mix all the dry ingredients. Then add your cold butter into the processor a little at a time, pulsing in between each addition of butter until the dough consists of rough chunks no larger than a pea and are evenly distributed. Finally, remove your dough from the food processor to prevent overmixing before adding the liquid. Is this a bit hypocritical to say after scaring you with an entire video about mistakes you almost certainly have made while baking? Probably, but it's true. Biscuits are incredibly forgiving. If you have ever committed any of these biscuit sins, you likely still ended up with an edible biscuit.
Is that all you think about? Biscuits, please, please, please. Nothing else matters. Biscuits, please.
If you have chosen to make your own biscuits rather than buy them, don't get so caught up in doing everything perfectly. Baking is supposed to be a peaceful activity. Plus, practice makes perfect. If they don't turn out the way you hoped the first time, you can always eat this batch and try again later.
When your baking sheets begin to darken and char, don't throw them away just yet. In fact, you should stop doing a whole lot of things with your baking sheets that you probably don't pay much attention to. Martha Stewart says one of the best ways you can extend the life of your baking sheets is by using a liner. The most common liners are silicone mats, aluminum foil, and parchment paper. While each liner will protect your baking sheet, you can save your cooking by choosing the right one for the job. Noted pastry chef and food writer Stella Parks advises against using silicone sheets for baking things like cookies. In an article Parks wrote for Serious Eats, she demonstrated how silicone sheets could completely alter a recipe. Parks baked several batches of cookies, one tray using parchment paper and the other one using silicone mats, and consistently showed that cookies baked on silicone mats came out darker and more spread out.
That's a really, really good cookie.
When roasting vegetables, the bakeware company Nordic Ware notes under its care instructions that aluminum sheets react negatively to acidic foods, such as vinegar and tomatoes, so a liner should be used. Vegetarian Times also recommends cooking vegetables on parchment paper rather than foil to decrease aluminum leaching at high temperatures, although they do note that both can be used. It's tempting to stick your baking sheets into the dishwasher after a long day of cooking, but you should resist that temptation. Most baking sheets are not dishwasher safe, with Nordic Ware claiming that putting baking sheets in the dishwasher can cause discoloration, though it doesn't affect the sheet's overall usefulness. Home Cook World goes further to note that, in addition to cosmetic discoloration, it can cause metal sheets to rust and damage the nonstick coating. Using a baking liner can not only make cleanup easier, but help reduce the temptation to stick the baking sheets into the dishwasher. But if you are someone who still wants to put them in the dishwasher, make sure you get baking sheets that are specifically dishwasher safe. While Home Cook World recommends not placing baking sheets in dishwashers, they also advise to not reach for steel wool or other abrasive pan scrubbers to remove baked-on messes. For basic cleaning, warm soapy water with a non-abrasive implement such as a nylon brush or a washcloth is recommended. If the food still remains, let the sheet soak in warm soapy water to loosen baked-on messes. After soaking for some time, the sheets should come clean. If all else fails, you can use a non-abrasive cleaner to remove buildup and tough pieces from the sheets, but only if they're plain metal without a nonstick coating. The best method involves using small circular motions and applying just enough pressure to help ease off the cooked-on food. With these methods, your baking sheets will stay clean and intact for years. Using metal utensils on baking sheets will, at best, make them unattractive. At worst, you'll need to replace the sheets altogether. Using a metal utensil like a knife on an uncoated sheet will leave ugly nicks and scratches, and doing so will also cause your knife blade to dull, ruining 2 implements in one go.
Well, that's no good. You won't kill many orcs with a blunt blade.
The problems with metal implements only worsen if you have a non-stick coated sheet. Healthline reports that using metal utensils on non-stick sheets will scratch and flake off the coating, leading to small amounts getting into your food. This can be particularly problematic for sheets made before 2013, when they included the harmful chemical PFOA. To avoid these problems, Nordic Ware recommends using only nylon, wooden, or silicone-based utensils on their baking sheets. While discoloration may be a turnoff to some people, it isn't a sign that baking sheets need to be replaced. Even with proper care, baking sheets will start aging and will appear darker over time, largely due to oils cooking onto the pans. Many people are tempted to toss out their baking sheets once signs of aging show up, but according to the Seattle Times, that's the last thing you should do. As the sheets gain a brown layer, or patina, they start to conduct heat a little differently. The darker the sheet, the hotter they get, with one-sided experiment claiming the pan can reach up to 50 degrees hotter. While you may want to keep them in mint condition, you may not be doing your cooking any favors. Baking sheets typically warp when they are exposed to extreme changes in temperature. This can include sheets being moved from room temperature into a very hot oven or sticking a hot sheet under cool water. While you may be tempted to use warped sheets, they can cause more trouble than they're worth. A warped sheet won't be able to cook specific food items. One article from the Cook and Recipe Organizer app describes how using a warped baking sheet can cause oil to pool when roasting, leading to uneven cooking. While this can be annoying, it can also become a safety issue, as oil can leak off the sheet and cause smoke or even a grease fire. To prevent warping your baking sheets, try to avoid rapid temperature changes. Consider warming up your sheet as the oven preheats, and let the sheet cool before washing it. While some warping may be fixable, if your baking sheets are permanently and severely warped, consider buying a new one. It pays to get high-quality baking sheets. While it doesn't necessarily mean you should go out and spend a fortune, upgrading them to a quality set will make a massive difference. High-quality baking sheets are less likely to warp than their cheaper counterparts, partially due to the thickness of the metal. Thicker baking sheets, in general, are less prone to warping. The type of metal the sheet is made from will also affect the final product. Aluminum is the most common and affordable. A high-quality aluminum sheet can give you lasting benefits, like quick heat-up times and a non-stick coating. But if you upgrade to stainless steel, you get a more durable sheet that can be physically thinner while still maintaining its high quality. Though while stainless steel conducts heat more evenly than aluminum, it isn't as non-stick as aluminum. When cooking, make sure to distribute food evenly on the baking sheet. Unevenly distributing food can cause warm and cool spots on the sheet, which can then lead to warping. Uneven heat distribution can cause baked goods like cookies to bake unevenly. To keep the heat distribution uniform, spread food on the sheet evenly and consider rotating the pan while cooking. If there isn't enough food to cover the whole baking sheet, it's better to use a smaller sheet than to underload a larger one. Standard baking sheets come in sizes that range from a full sheet pan, typically 18 inches by 26 inches, down to an eighth of the size at 6.5 inches by 9.5 inches. So no matter how big your project is, there's a correct baking sheet size for you.